For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Lumkile Nkomfe. Joining me today is author and academic Dr. Solam Mkhabela, here to discuss his book titled Alexandra, A Backstory. Dr. Mkhabela, your book powerfully uncovers the rich and distinctive history of Alexandra Township, a vibrant and resilient community in Johannesburg. Can you detail the events that led to the creation of this township in 1912?
So there was this guy called Herbert Pappenfuss who bought Cypher Fontaine 2 farmland. It's the farmland would currently sites amongst things Sandton, Alexandra, and the surrounds, Marlborough. So remember with the genesis of Johannesburg, gold was discovered in 1886, which then triggered a gold rush to this part of the world from people all over the globe. This farm, as we know, where Sandton and Alex are located, sort of like almost 13 kilometers from the epicenter of downtown Johannesburg. Pappenfuss had the idea of subdividing the land and selling it to white settlers who then were here because of the gold rush. So it was for economic purposes. He subdivided the land into particular plots and he couldn't sell them to white people. White people at the time felt that it was too far from where the action was, which is downtown Joburg. So if you look at, for example, where the gold reef is and where gold was discovered, and at the time then the state had started to give miners plots which were located in the triangle between the three farms. And the three farms was Bromfontein Farm to the west, Doorfontein Farm to the east, and Turfontein Farm to the south. And the lines that divided those was basically End Street, current End Street in Johannesburg now, and then the diagonal, what's called Diagonal Street, which basically picks up from the top of Louisburg and Hillbrow. You know, it makes this diagonal and then it becomes Empire. But if you continue that diagonal, it goes all the way into Diagonal Street in Johannesburg and meets the south boundary is contested, maybe Harrington Street or something. Yeah, but that would be the south. So anyway, miners were given plots there. So if you look where that triangle is compared to where Pappenfuss was trying to sell these plots, it's quite far. Yeah? People didn't have cars at the time. So it was basically horseback, donkey, or in some instances, bicycles. So that's why he couldn't sell the land. So he got permission to subdivide it even further and sell it to Black people. And at the time, the regime in the country was basically putting in the mechanics of the Land Act that then got enacted in 1913. But already before that, there were particular acts that started to strip land from Black people, where Black people lost the land. So people would hear around South Africa, hey, but there's this place in Jersey where we can buy land and own it, sectional title, and have this land belong to you. And Black people didn't mind also being that far. So there was also that influx of Black people coming to Johannesburg to work at the mines, and they needed a place to stay. So Pappenfuss struck gold, and he could sell that land to Black people, and colored people as well. And that's how Alexandra started. And it was declared native township in 1912.
And why was it so important for you to highlight the significance of apartheid legislation in relation to property rights in Alexandria?
It's because the current situation in South Africa is a result of, in my view, 4 seminal laws. And when I talk about the current situation in South Africa, I'm talking about the haves and the have-nots across the racial spectrum? Why do we have, for example, high levels of unemployment in the Nguni population? Why do we have high levels of uneducated people in the Nguni population? And why is it that corporate South Africa, even so many years after the first democratic elections of South Africa, still hire white and continue white privilege? Why do we have places like Westcliff or Bishop Courts in Cape Town, and you have places like Khayelitsha or Soweto or Soshanguve? So the fragmentation of space on land is a result of particular acts. And one of them that started this was the Land Act of 1913, which basically gave the white population 90% of the land and gave the black population, which was at the time around 90%, 10% of the land. So that started a situation, for example, where people had to come to Alex because they were taxed now coming from KZN or the Eastern Cape. They had to either work for white farmers who had stolen their land, or rather had taken it through a political means because they could, because the state said they could, that the land belongs to them. People lost their livelihood, lost their cattle, lost basically their economic income. So they became, in a way, short-term migrant slaves for the industry that was happening here. So it was systematic to say, look, we're going to put tax on you. You're not going to be able to afford it. So you need to come and work and earn income so you can pay for those tax. So Alex then represents all those economic processes. The next one was politically the Native Urban Areas Act of 1923, which came from the Stallard Commission, which basically started to implement the racial structure which the National Party used as a ticket in 1948. So in 1950, further division happened now in the metropolitan areas, whereby you had the Group Areas Act, where dormitories like Eldorado Park, Lenasia, Soweto could happen. And all the good spaces and healthy spaces were left for white people. You just have to look at Cape Town to look at the ideal apartheid city, where the City Bowl is close to the mountains, beautiful areas were reserved for white people. And then further out, places for black people like Khayelitsha. And that was a result of the Group Areas Act. And then the one that really fractured everything was the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which came into effect in 1954 and was practiced. Now, the Bantu Education Act said black education up to the point where there could be servants for white privilege. You need people to do the menial tasks, not to occupy the top floor, but to enforce that the top floor exists and it can operate functionally. And all those four laws created the system of apartheid that still perpetuates today. Alexander became a metaphor to enact and showcase all those four laws, socially, politically, and economically, how they operate.
Can you detail some of the ways that Alexandra has been able to help shape and refine the socio-political and cultural imagination of Johannesburg?
Absolutely. Now, remember, based on those four laws, people have no access to land expropriation without compensation, right? It stems from the Land Act of 1913. And then the Areas Act basically restricted black people into the urban areas, that you could only be there with a dompas to be a servant of white privilege. And then 1950 basically fragmented space, which is why you have a situation like Sandton, and then you have a situation like Soweto. And then the Bantu Education Act, which I've just spoken about. So people in Alex have all those things stacked against them. They have no access to land, which then they can use to generate income. They were restricted to operate in an urban context, and they suffer from a lack of education, formal education, to then be employed in those towers of Santon to occupy those spaces. So they have to come up with ingenious ways of maintaining livelihood. And I call that the twilight zone. They have to basically use other resources available to them and think outside of conventional practice to operate. And the street offers an opportunity for that. Now, it's not unique to Alexandra or Johannesburg. The street has always been a place for trade. Going back to the East and to the Greeks or to the Romans, the street itself was always a place for opportunity because it allows particular encounters to unfold. So when you're on the street, which is the seminal public space, I can meet you, you and I can have a conversation, and we can dilute and pollute our ideals, and through that interaction, we can grow or we can trade. Then the more active the street is, the better those conditions are, the more dynamic that situation is. So people in Alex have to use the street in a particular way that then allows them to have a livelihood. And some of the usage of the street is against what top-down policy planning is implemented. Like, for example, it says when Parkstar did Operation Clean Sweep in the 2000s, and it says we can't have people trading on the street. It gives a particular texture that is not preferred. Right. So the bylaws are in violation of how public space should be used, for example. So people have to find ways that is ingenious, like a hole in the wall where they can sell their fat cooks or this. It's created a particular economy that is so clever that us as special practitioners should be looking at to get clues. So it's an intelligence that is based on particular situated conditions and based on need. If you go, for example, to Mozambique, the street itself becomes an extension of the market. And Abdul Maluk writes about this. If you go to Nairobi, you look at Kenya, or you look at Nigeria, the street itself is a market where you can get anything on the street. You can get your goat, you can get a cell phone, you can get your chargers, you can get a computer, and you can meet your future wife, for example, on the street, on the street. The street is a place where all imaginations become possible. And people in Alex have, because of those policies that are highlighted, have come up with ingenious ways that is far more advanced. I'm talking about urban planners. I'm talking about the city and its agents from the top, right? If you look at it from the top, they occupy city council, and then the agents are city planners, which look at things at a larger scale. Then architects would look at the meso or micro scale in volume or in spatial making, and then engineers who allow then the infrastructure to connect those things. So those are the three main ones, but within those, obviously, embedded other disciplines, but those are the three key ones then that create cities as we know them. You need the laws that says, here are going to be schools, here's going to be a hospital, or here's going to be an airport or a harbor, or this is a residential area. That comes from planning. And then how that looks, the translation of that policy into form, into urban forms, you need architects and engineers. So the twilight intelligence that happens at a particular micro scale in Alex is far more advanced than how spatial practice can anticipate. So the premise that I'm saying within the book is that we as spatial practice need to learn from how people are using the street in itself, because the way we think people use the street doesn't work. Look at the BRT, for example.
In what ways can urban scripting audiovisual forms of storytelling help improve urban environments for marginalized communities such as Alexandra?
The stories, and sometimes it's used interchangeably with narrative. So, narrative basically is, in my definition, and from what other scholars say, is the story itself and the medium that creates narrative. So, narrative basically exists everywhere. For example, you go into church windows and you see those pictorials on the form. It's on the street, the rhetorics of the street, etc. But stories are the oldest form of communication. Ever since people lived in the caves, when they'd come home, they'd tell each other stories. You know, if you go by that tree or you go fish in that pond, you get better fish, or, you know, you shouldn't go there because there's danger there. That's how we created knowledge and intelligence, through storytelling. And there are scholars, for example, like Klaske Havek, Achille Mbembe, and Leonie Sandercock, who advocate for a new narrative that recalibrates close readings and interpretations of how narrative does things, how they intervene into the world, and they influence daily life. I'll give you an example. Everything that you see in front of you and behind you, like, for example, that skyline of Jersey with that Hillbrow Tower, anything that you can imagine, a car, a rocket ship, a teaspoon, a cell phone, sunglasses, t-shirt, all those things once started as a concept in someone's head. So this thought then was turned to something material. The thought itself is silent. So the person that thought about basically sending a rocket ship to the moon must have sat there one time and thought about it, and then made some notes and did some drawings, told a story to someone else. And through that storytelling, people created this thing that can define laws of physics and nature and basically escape the gravitational pull of the Earth and plant itself on the moon. It's through stories that triggers the imagination. And that's the essential part of it for me. And through that imagination, other possibilities can come to be. Through hearing the stories and actively hearing the stories of the protagonists in Alexandra, I could then do that book. Without those stories, it was impossible. Without people telling me how the Land Act of 1913 or the Urban Areas Act of 1923 or the Group Areas Act of 1950 or Bantu Education of 1953 influenced not only their lives, but the lives of people that they love, I could then generate a particular story that tells of a reality today.
In writing this graphic account, how important was it for you to consider negating the damaging effects of voyeuristic and exploitative classism in providing accurate depictions and illustrations of Alexandra?
Very important. Urban scripting in itself is rooted in two seminal dimensions: empathy and ethics. The empathy is about listening without judging, to say, I hear you, ngiyakuzwa, I can understand where you're coming from. And how do I understand? I can demonstrate my understanding through the audiovisual story. So before the book was published, this material that went into its making was showcased to the community in Alexandra, where we had a screening at Braniki's place. And he invited people from his community to come have a look and to comment. Urban scripting is like a coin, one coin with two sides, heads or tails. You can't say that the coin is represented by the head or by the tails. It's just the coin with two sides. And what are the two sides of urban scripting is what I call inside storytellers and outside storytellers. And that coin has to be complete for it to work. So me working with Braniki, for example, he's the inside storyteller. I come from the outside. So I bring in, for example, the drawing material. I bring in people to come and talk to things. I bring other infrastructures that might not exist on the inside. But the collaboration is through inside and outside. And that makes the product the same. So I did publish the book and my name appears there, but its making was through inside people and external people. And I think that makes it a bit more authentic.
Can you elaborate more on the spatial imperatives required for effective urban design and planning?
Imagination is required, and having an unbiased approach. So where spatial practice has gotten it wrong in the past is I went to school and I trained for this, and I'm qualified to do this. And they use example of a doctor, a brain surgeon. You know, if I have a tumor in my head, the doctor is not going to say, look, Solam, how do you think we should go about the operation? Right? They'll just do it because they have the knowledge. So people think the making of spatial form should follow the same format. And I say no. Why? Because a settlement is fundamentally about people and how people use space. And that's a very complex thing. A brain tumor you can find in China, you can find in Tanzania, you can find in Chile, you can find in Vrededorp or in Manzini. It's an anomaly that affects the body, just like a toothache. But how we use space, a lot of layers come into that. There's culture, there's climate, there's social and economic and political dimensions. It's very complicated, right? But we all breathe. With the body still takes in oxygen and expels carbon dioxide. We all fall in love, we all get hungry. But how that's done, especially like if you go to Greenland, how people live in Greenland is very different to how people live in the Sahara. And how people live in the Sahara is very different to how people live in the Karoo, even though these are sort of semi-arid or arid places. Just across the border, how people live in Mozambique is very different to how people live in South Africa. And even within South Africa, how people live in Durban and how people live in Joburg, how people live in Cape Town and how people live in Gqeberha, all different. So how do we then intervene? And I'll use the word appropriately in those spaces. We need to understand so much. We need to understand so many forces. And how does that understanding happen? And that's the question you're asking me, Lumke. The understanding goes through talking to people and finding out what is it that they need, what is it that they want, and what is it that they want for purely cosmetic purposes or for fundamental purposes, which can make their lives better tomorrow. And some of those things are infrastructure. And what do I mean by infrastructure? I mean the network that connects things to each other. So, for example, we need to have collecting bodies that can hold the water, and that water has to get to our toilets and flush. Or we can get that water to then drink or cook with. So at one level, you need to have adequate infrastructure. Things must work and things must be continually managed. It's like you buying a really nice car and not putting in petrol. That car is not different. You might as well house chickens in it. Even if it's a Ferrari, it's useless. So for you to maintain that car, you have to take it into service. It has to have an oil change. Its shocks have to be checked. It has to be maintained for it to have longevity. Same thing as a city. It requires work and it requires investment. So I'll give an example. In South Africa, we have some of the most dense places in population size. If you have two things, Houghton and Hillbrow, one is seriously dense, Hillbrow. Does it make sense for Pick It Up to come once a week to both places? You can't measure those two spaces and say they need the same thing, right? So I would even say that Pick It Up should come into Hillbrow twice a day, for example, in the morning and in the evening, for Hillbrow to maintain that level of cleanliness that Houghton has, which can come once a week. And those are the things that you have to look at. You have to look at the macro, and then you have to look at the micro and say, what is it that the area needs, and how is it that it can enhance livability? And one crucial thing is obviously employment, right? But now the formal sector, when I say the formal sector here, I'm talking about corporate institutions like Rosebank or Sandton, whereby you can go there and work. They absorb a particular person, but they can't absorb all of us. They can't absorb even very qualified people that graduate with the degrees. So people have to then create their own employment in a way, which is what spaces like Alex start to show, that twilight intelligence. So we as spatial practice have to allow for that twilight intelligence to flourish. We can't stifle it. So what do we need? We need infrastructure. So particular sidewalks where that trade can happen. We need street lights where the trade hours can go for longer. And we need places that are hotspots, for example, where people can download information very quickly or have very strong cellular networks, because everybody now, including your grandmother, has a cell phone.
And finally, what would you like readers to take away from your book?
I talk about the other, and the other represents basically what was not seen as mainstream in white, male, conservative, God-fearing construct. So that includes then people that didn't really fit in that notion of whiteness per se. You can't fear that. You can't fear the other. You need to know the other. For us to coexist as a species, we need to celebrate our differences and embrace them and talk about them and make that difference something positive as opposed to a negative. And that's the thing about humanity. At the fundamental core, humanness, Ubuntu is an amazing thing. So how about we start unleashing and embracing our differences through storytelling as a way? For example, let's tell each other more stories. Let's talk about how we can be inclusive as opposed to be exclusive. Let's embrace each other as a species and work towards a common goal where we all benefit. It can't be that the world is driven for profit at the expense of our humanity. And that's what the essence of this book is about. Humanity over profit.
That was Dr. Solam Mkhabela discussing his book titled Alexandra, A Backstory.